Stylistics is an approach to the study of literature that applies concepts and methods from linguistics, understood as the scientific analysis of language rather than learning of multiple languages. Emerging largely in the 20th century, stylistics aims to explain how linguistic features such as grammar, syntax, vocabulary, and sound patterns contribute to meaning and shape the reader's response. By closely examining how language works within literary texts, stylistics seeks to make literary effects observable and explainable. At first glance, stylistics appears more practical than theoretical. Much stylistic work focuses on the detailed analysis of individual texts rather than on the construction of large abstract theoretical systems. For this reason, it is often omitted from major surveys of literary theory and treated merely as a method. However, this view is misleading. Stylistics is grounded in clear assumptions about how language functions in literature, and these assumptions form a coherent theoretical work even if they are not presented as a grand theory. Stylistics shares several characteristics with liberal humanism. Both emphasize close reading, rely on empirical observation, and concentrate on individual literary works rather than on broad ideological structures. They also tend to avoid the theoretical eclecticism found in Marxist, feminist, structuralist, and post structuralist criticism. And they usually reject the idea that meaning is endlessly unstable. Despite these similarities, stylistics and liberal humanism were in conflict during the 1960s, largely because stylistics challenged impressionistic interpretation by insisting on linguistic evidence. Unlike many modern theories that embrace relativism, stylistics maintains confidence in the possibility of objective analysis and cumulative knowledge. Its positivist orientation values systematic description and verifiable evidence. This makes stylistics particularly accessible to students as it offers clear tools for analysis and encourages active engagement with text. Stylistics is not confined to literature alone. It can be applied to political speeches, advertisements, and everyday discourse based on the assumption that literary language is not fundamentally different from ordinary language. In this way, stylistics occupies a middle ground, recognizing the richness of literature while insisting that its effects can be carefully and rationally analyzed. Stylistics can be seen as a modern version of rhetoric, an ancient discipline that taught people how to speak and write effectively. In medieval times, rhetoric was important for training clergy, lawyers, and politicians. However, once it lost this practical purpose, it became overly mechanical, focusing on naming and classifying figures of speech. This narrow and pedantic approach was often mocked by writers like Chaucer and Shakespeare. Some traces of this old rhetoric survived in school education until recent times. During the 19th century, rhetoric gradually became part of linguistics, which was then known as philology. Philology mainly studied the history of languages, their origins, development, and relationships. In the 20th century, linguistics shifted away from history and began to focus on language as a system, examining how meanings are created and how sentences are structured. This change led to a renewed interest in style and literary language. This renewed focus appeared in the work of the Russian formalists and in the ideas of Roman Jakobson, a key figure in the Prague linguistic circle. Jakobson argued that the study of literature or poetics should be part of linguistics because both deal with verbal structure. These ideas were strongly presented at the 1958 Conference on Style, later published as Style in Language. This event increased tension between literary critics and linguists. Roger Fowler tried to reduce this tension by promoting cooperation between language and literary studies. However, critics like Helen Wendler argued that linguists lacked the skills needed to understand poetry fully. The debate that followed deepened the divide between the two fields. By the 1980s, developments in discourse analysis allowed linguists to study whole texts rather than isolated sentences. This led to what was sometimes called new stylistics, which was more open to other critical approaches. However, strong claims about objectivity and superiority continued on both sides. As a result, the idea that stylistics had completely changed is somewhat exaggerated. While stylistics today is more open and cooperative, its earlier debates and tensions still shape the field. Stylistics and close reading are both methods used to analyze literary texts, but they differ in their aims, methods, and assumptions. Stylistic analysis tries to be objective and scientific. It uses measurable linguistic evidence and follows clear systematic procedures. Traditional close reading, on the other hand, is often seen as stylisticians as impressionistic or intuitive, relying more on the critic's personal response than on fixed methods. One major difference concerns how each approach views literary language. Close reading usually treats literary language as special and different from everyday speech. It often sees the literary text as a self contained aesthetic object, sometimes called a verbal icon, whose language follows rules of its own. Stylistics stress the continuity between literary language and ordinary language, arguing that literature can be analyzed using the same tools as any other form of communication. This difference reflects an older debate in literary criticism. For example, Wordsworth believed that poetry works best when it uses simple, everyday language. Coleridge, however, argued that poetry becomes effective by intensifying language through patterns, repetition, and compression. Stylistics generally supports the idea that literary language is an extension of normal language rather than a completely separate kind. Another difference lies in the language used by critics. Stylistics uses technical terms from linguistics such as transitivity, collocation, and cohesion. These terms are specialized and not used in everyday conversation. Close reading prefers more familiar terms like irony, ambiguity, and paradox, which belong to ordinary language even though they have specific meanings in criticism. Stylistics aims to demystify both literature and criticism. It claims that its methods can be learned and applied by anyone. Close reading often values the critic's personal sensitivity and avoids clearly explaining its methods, sometimes suggesting that literature contains meanings that cannot be fully analyzed. Stylisticians try to use clear linguistic evidence to support what readers usually feel intuitively about a literary work. Instead of only saying this style feels plain or this character feels powerful, they ask precise questions about language and try to answer them with facts and examples. For example, many readers feel that Ernest Hemingway's style is simple and plain. A stylistician would ask what plain really means. They might notice that Hemingway often avoids adjectives and adverbs. Where another writer might say Smith ran purposefully through the heavy rain, Hemingway would write Smith ran through the rain. The stylistician could then count how many nouns and verbs appear without descriptive words and compare this with other writers. This does not tell us something completely new, but it explains exactly how Hemingway creates his simple style. Stylisticians also suggest new interpretations using linguistic knowledge. For instance, a critic argued that Falstaff in Shakespeare's plays shows sexual ambiguity because he uses the word womb for his stomach. At that time, womb could mean either stomach or a female organ. Since both meanings were possible, this might suggest confusion about Falstaff's sexual identity. However, this idea is debated because a word usually has only one meaning at a time in a given sentence. Another aim of stylistics is to explain how literary meaning is created in general. Linguists argue that meaning comes not only from what is said, but also from how it is used. In Tess of the D'Urbervilles, for example, the grammar often shows Alec as the subject who acts and Tess as the object who is acted upon. This reinforces the idea that Alak has power and Tess is powerless. The main idea is that literary meaning comes from many parts working together: grammar, sentence, structure, word choice, and imagery. Stylistics studies these patterns to show how language itself helps create meaning in literature. What stylistic critics do? Stylistic critics study the technical features of language in a text, such as grammar, sentence structure, and word choice. They then use this detailed language analysis to explain the meaning of the text. Sometimes their goal is simply to give objective linguistic evidence to support interpretations that readers already feel or believe about a literary work. At other times, stylistic critics use language evidence to offer a new interpretation of a text. This new reading may depend mostly on linguistic details and may question or challenge earlier interpretations. Stylistics is part of a larger idea that literature does not have a mysterious or magical meaning that cannot be explained. Instead, literary language works within the same system of communication as everyday language and can be analyzed in the same way. Because of this, stylistics does not study only literature, it often compares literary text with other kinds of writing, such as advertisements, speeches, or news reports, to show that similar language techniques are used everywhere. Stylistics goes beyond studying individual sentences. It looks at the whole text and examines how different language features work together to achieve certain effects, such as entertaining the reader, creating suspense, or persuading an audience.